thank you very much for attending this webinar. This is part of our Brownbag seminar series and the Faculty of Social Sciences, Universitas Islam International Indonesia. We regularly conduct this seminar usually twice a month to discuss important political and social issues facing our contemporary society. I am Sirajuddin Arif, the head of MA in Political Science program at the university, and I will be your moderator today. For some of you who may attend our seminar series for the first time, let me say just a few things about the university. Officially named Universitas Islam International Indonesia, this is a brand new university initiated by the government of Indonesia. The university was founded in 2015 by President Joko Widodo as part of the government's national strategic projects. And after a few years of infrastructural development, the university has just begun its first operation last year. And now actually we are in the second semester of the first year. And as you may know from our website, the university has three missions. One is to provide excellent graduate education in Islamic studies, to develop innovative research on Islam and Muslim societies, and contributing to the development of knowledge and social welfare, and to promote Indonesian Islamic culture as part of the world civilization. We invite and we provide scholarship for students, especially from other countries, to study the unique historical development of Islam in Indonesia. Compared to Islam in other parts of the world, we believe that Indonesian Islam offers a distinctive form of social and religious formation compatible with democracy and economic development. In first year, we received more than 1,000 applications from 59 countries, and we admitted 100 students who came from 20 countries, including Indonesia. Around 35 of our students are from other countries, and we strive to improve the proportion of international students in our student body. So right now we have 4 faculties, namely Faculty of Islamic Studies, Faculty of Education, Faculty of Economics and Business, and Faculty of Social Sciences. But we will open other faculties like Art and Engineering in the near future. And so back to our webinar today, we are happy to have Dr. Alvin Camba, Assistant Professor at Joseph Corbett School of the University of Denver, United States. And he has conducted in-depth research on the development of China's foreign direct investment in Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. He is also interested in the political economy of energy and mining. His works have appeared in many highly reputable journals like the Review of International Political Economy, Resources Policy, Environmental Policy and Governance, Development and Change, and many others. And today we asked him to talk about his book manuscript. We are very happy and very honored to be one of the first audience of the book manuscript, titled The Strong Leader Paradox, How China's Global Investment Strategy Transformed Host Country Politics. As you have known, then the rapid economic growth that the China enjoyed during the last few decades has made the country not only the new global economic powerhouse, but also a global investor. But the rest of China and its massive investments around the world bring many significant consequences, not only in economy, but also in politics. China's investments are certainly not free from geopolitical and political considerations, which may affect the trajectory of political development of the recipient country. So we asked Dr. Camba to share his knowledge and expertise on this important issue. Without further ado, let me invite Dr. Camba to give his presentation. I will give you, say, 40 to 50 minutes, Dr. Camba, before we can have question and answer session. So, Dr. Camba, the screen is yours now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ciro, for inviting me, and thank you, Phillips, for inviting me as well. It's been a long time. I remember meeting you in Jakarta in 2017 when I was starting my research. It's great to see you again. Do you mind enabling, Ciro? Do you mind enabling the participant Zoom? I'm not enabled to. Yeah, I'm like disabled from sharing.
Okay. Mas Manda, would you mind to help me to allow Dr. Camba to share the screen?
Dijadikan co-host saja, Nabila. Pak Alvinnya dijadikan co-host.
Is my presentation clear? Is it there?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Can see now. Thank you.
Okay. The first thing is that apologies for being late. Well, I'm happy I'm presenting in people in a context where people are understanding. The title. So the title is. I'm still working on the title. So Ciro might have said something different. It's my fault. But the this is a book manuscript under review, right? That has recently received a revise and resubmit at Columbia University Press. I'm shopping it around after. I did a book workshop of this a few month ago, and I'm hoping to. I got the revise and resubmit, but in the book workshop, I got a different set of comments, which is the comments are harder than the revise and resubmit in the book. So I'm trying to reconcile the revise and resubmit of the workshop and the revise and resubmit in the book proposal. But at the moment, I'm presenting. This is relatively. This is a work in progress, but it's my dissertation that I can transform into a book, and I revise it according to I'm revising it according to the workshop participants, and you are the first audience that you are the first audience who will listen to sort of this revised version. This is not the version that got a revise and resubmit because that was the old version. This is the new one. So happy to present this. The title of my presentation is The Strong Leader Paradox, or the book, The Unintended Consequences of China's Global Investment Strategy. Although the second part, I'm still playing with it. I think that the one that Ciro said is a more catchy title, How Chinese Capital Transforms Host Country Politics. Either way, I'm going to start with the short outline, the question, the argument, the cases, focus on the framework, the empirics, and the conclusion. This book, just to preface it, it uses mainly cases from Southeast Asia, particularly the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. I spent a year doing fieldwork in Jakarta and particularly focusing on the Joko Widodo administration. Although, of course, I would defer to you all about in terms of the expertise on like in Indonesia, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it. Nonetheless, this presentation focuses on two Philippine cases, and then I look at the Malaysian and Indonesian case briefly before looking at a particular African case. The main question that I look at least in this presentation, but not necessarily the book, I word the question differently, but it's relatively similar. Does Chinese capital strengthen autocracy? And when we think about Chinese capital, we're not just talking about foreign direct investments. Foreign direct investment is one form of commercial relationship. It's ownership of more than 10%. The foreign investor owns more than 10% of the asset and can exercise prerogatives and decisions in the firm. Nonetheless, Chinese money comes in many different forms. There's development finance, the so-called government-to-government projects. In some ways, it's called foreign aid, but technically that's not an appropriate way to describe Chinese money or Chinese development finance, because foreign aid is technically OECD, DAC, overseas development assistance, and Chinese development finance diverge from the definition. But Chinese capital can also come in different forms, such as commercial and political relations. The relationship of political parties, for instance, with the CCP in China, the relationship of UMNO in Malaysia and the CCP, the relationship of PDP Laban in the Philippines and the CCP, the relationship of the Makali political party in Nepal and the CCP. Many different ways and forms of how Chinese capital comes in. Now, the way this is answered in the literature is it comes in two ways. There's an IR literature that it's a top-down literature where people look at Chinese economic influence, so Chinese capital in some ways, foreign direct investments, development finance, and other inflows, CCP political party relations, governance model, and it transmits ideology and geopolitical goals, and then this goes to the host country. And autocracy expands because of Chinese money. So this is how people understand Chinese autocratic influence conventionally. You can sort of see this in different publications. So this is a publication by the International Republican Institute. China promotes an authoritarian model. The resilience of its democracy targets is key. You can also see this in some other ways and forms. This is a Brookings publication. China expands global authoritarian influence efforts. Fragile democracies show resilience against CCP efforts. So this is a very common argument, and in the way it's portrayed in the media, this is like how people understand like how China expands autocracy. There is another literature which looks at instead of looking at China, people look at the host country regime. So the host country regime is already autocratic. What the regime does is it courts and draws in Chinese capital to forward its goals. What does the regime do? The regime sells geopolitical and economic interests to China. It tells China, oh, we'll give you this if you give us Chinese money. As a result, China passively agrees and inflows of Chinese capital comes in the country. It gives the regime the opportunity to use that money to forward the goals of the regime. Now, I'm a bit more sympathetic to the second literature, the host country literature. You can see this. This is an article that was written by this journalist in the Philippines, where he was talking about the article I wrote for the Carnegie Endowment, where I've demonstrated how the Duterte government used the Chinese projects to forward its political strength and political goals. This is the article that I published at the Carnegie Endowment, and in some ways I'm sympathetic to this literature, but I'm not the only one writing on this. Other people have written as well. Like there's Guani Lim in Grips. He's written about Najib in Malaysia. There's Trisha Wijaya, who's Chinese Indonesian, who's written about the Jokowi administration as well. Now, the problem with the literature, both perspectives, including my own writing before, I include my writing in the problem as well, is that in the first literature, Chinese economic gravity tilts countries towards autocracy. So it trains political parties and elites, supposedly. Now, I find it to be, it obstructs agency. It assumes a one-way direction of like Chinese influence and sort of like elites in the host country, as if elites will simply follow what China is telling them or what China wants. Now, the second literature has a problem because in some ways, in the second literature, including my own work, it already assumes the regime is already authoritarian, and it's becoming more authoritarian because of China. It doesn't show the transformative influence of what China does. What it simply shows is that, oh, there's a regime, and the regime is bad, and it uses Chinese money to forward its own political goals and maintain autocracy. Even though I'm sympathetic to the second literature, I can understand how it's a bit static, and it's a bit the framework is not dynamic at all. Now, in this particular case, there is a question for both literatures of the scope. What kind of regime matters anyway, or what is the scope of the analysis? In particular, does Chinese capital have a transformative effect in host country politics across different regimes, or are we just talking about regimes of a particular kind? Now, both literatures offer some truth, but the direction is one way, and there's a need for a dynamic framework that is both comparative and interactive. And in this book manuscript, I try to present this interactive sort of like this more interactive framework that sort of tries to like link China and the host country politics all together. Now, I argue now when we think about regimes that are being transformed by Chinese money, I think we should mainly be talking about hybrid regimes. So hybrid regimes can either be semi-competitive authoritarianism. So some people call Malaysia and Thailand to be semi-competitive authoritarianism, or weak democracies. Some people have said the Philippines is a weak democracy. A lot of people have said that. Some people have said Indonesia as well is a weak democracy. You all can decide on that, but people have used this hybrid regime as a term to talk about regimes that are neither super extremely democratic and regimes that are not authoritarian at all. There are some features of this that we can all agree on. Presence of poorly institutionalized democratic institutions, elite control of politics and economy, high level of competition can occur amongst elites, varying levels of implementation gap. There's a gap between the implementation and the stated rule of law, political rights, freedom, and other definitions. I don't want to spend a lot of time in the definition of what a hybrid regime is because this is not the argument of my book. But what I'm trying to say is that when we think about the impact of Chinese capital in terms of transforming a country's politics, it makes sense to talk about hybrid regimes because hybrid regimes are in between fully democratic countries and autocratic countries. If we think about the extreme cases, the impact of Chinese capital will either be different or it will not impact the country at all, such as the case of, I would say, fully democratic countries. Now, it's easy to think about fully authoritarian countries. The case of North Korea is one. You can think about Cambodia as the other. how China transforms politics is, I don't think it transforms anything at all. It just simply makes the country more authoritarian. It works with the leader, which is, North Korea is Kim Jong-il. In Cambodia, it's Hun Sen. By investing money in the leader, China is able to maintain influence over the country. Now, if you think about fully democratic countries, this is the example of Norway. And, I completely understand there's an entire debate on democracy. I don't mean to fixate on, whiteness as democracy. I don't believe in that. But there is, when we think about strong democracies, Norway is probably one of the best examples. And, any sort of attempt by Chinese firms or the Chinese government to subvert the rule of law will be stopped by the Norwegian courts or the Norwegian government, the Norwegian bureaucracy. Now, given that we're not talking about the extreme cases here, we're talking about hybrid regimes. The question of this presentation is that how does the surge of Chinese capital tilt hybrid regimes towards authoritarianism or democracy? So this is my research question. And the argument I make is that when we think about hybrid regimes, the way China works in these cases is they invest in what they perceive as strong leaders. Now, I'm sorry, this is I formatted this using what they call this overleaf, which is what they call this programming. So this came up and I don't know why. When I mean strong leaders in hybrid regimes, I'm talking about leaders who have a broad coalition of elites. These are leaders who can influence a large number of elites, people who have strong coalitions. And people who are not strong, I would say, have a narrow coalition of elites. Now, this goes back to coalitional politics and political science. But the idea that I have here is that the Chinese government and sort of the CCP does not have a strong understanding of how democracy works in any case. The way they approach hybrid regimes is if they can win over a leader who can influence other elites, then they can win over the politics of the country. So they try to look for leaders who have a broad coalition of elites. Now, the problem is if China gets it right, meaning they actually invested capital in a leader with broad coalition, I would argue a mode of issue linkages occur. Issue linkages means that China becomes fused with the regime's political and economic interests, enabling the leaders to use Chinese capital to maximize their hold on coalitions and subvert democratic institutions. In other words, if the regime is a hybrid regime and then the leader has a broad coalition, and the leader is indeed a strong leader, by investing Chinese money in these leaders with broad coalitions, this leader can now use Chinese money to subvert Chinese capital to strengthen the hold on the coalition further and subvert democratic institutions. And in some ways, what also happens is that the leader is able to push back against Chinese interests, meaning that the leader will not be a puppet of China in an absolute sense. The leader will use the relationship with China to push back against the interests of the Chinese. And you may ask the question, why will the Chinese allow that? For the simple fact that China is now dependent on the leader. And this dependency creates a relationship where they don't have any choice but to accept the pushback from the leader. So that's my mode of issue linkages. Now, if China gets it wrong, I would argue a mode of contention occurs, meaning they invest in a leader. They try to look for a leader with a broad coalition, but they make a mistake. They suddenly invest in a leader with a narrow coalition, even though the lead or it's more like so I'm trying to reframe my argument here. It's more like if the leader doesn't have a broad coalition, what happens if Chinese money comes in is that it makes the coalition of the leader even smaller because there's a transformative effect from Chinese money. So what happens in mode of contention is that host country elites mobilize against the leader, increasing the chances of canceling major Chinese projects. Increased vigilance strengthens democratic institutions. And I would like to give an example of mode of contention just to clarify it. The perfect case here is the Arroyo administration in the Philippines between 2001 and 2010. When Arroyo came in the Philippines as a president, she was very popular, and her popularity decreased somewhat after a few years. but she still has a somewhat, relatively, okay enough coalition of elites. When Chinese money came in, what it effectively does is it exacerbated and it made the conditions worse for her. It actually weakened Arroyo's hold over her own elites because of the multiple issues that have occurred after. Eventually, Arroyo was kicked out by the Aquino government, and the Aquino government strengthened democratic institutions in the Philippines by implementing a bunch of regulations that made it harder for Chinese money and other types of it's made it harder for Chinese money to sort of like come in the country. So what the Arroyo administration demonstrates, and I'm going to explain this later, is that paradoxically, Chinese money ended up weakening the leader, in this case Arroyo, and by weakening the leader, it led to the cancellation of Chinese projects. And the cancellation of Chinese projects in the next regime ended up in a situation where the democratic institutions have strengthened, and that is a situation because the Chinese got it wrong and they invested in a leader with a narrower coalition. Now, I'm going to talk about my framework, but before I do, I will explain the research done on this project. I did around 250 interviews in five countries across like Southeast Asia. That includes Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong. A lot of my China-related interviews came from Hong Kong, and a lot of my interviews, and then I also did interviews in Thailand, in Singapore as well, because a lot of the Chinese officials, when they want to be interviewed, they don't want to be interviewed in the Southeast Asian state. They want to be interviewed in Singapore, where there's a stronger security state apparatus that stops potential Chinese agents from coming in. So that's like a secret when you do interviews with like Chinese actors. They feel safe in Singapore. A lot of the interviews came with like political elites of the countries, from senators in the Philippines to ministers in Indonesia, parliamentarians in Malaysia. I've been able to interview Chinese actors, from the Chinese executive officials and SOEs to Chinese ministry officials in the embassy as well. Although the embassy is a bit harder to do right now, it was possible to do it before in 2016-17. Now, the argument I have, so in explaining my framework, and so I can talk about the method later much more, but in explaining my framework, I make an argument that China's approach to investing in whom they perceive as strong leaders. It comes from their own practices that actually come from China. It comes from their own socially embedded practices. So this comes from the sociological idea of Mark Granovetter. The concept that we are all embedded in our social context, and we have different and we can never fully approach the same. We can never have the same we can never have the full rational strategy in approaching something, because our social norms will affect how we act, and this is true in many different contexts, right? Now, when the Chinese state in dealing with hybrid regimes, it has its own preference. So they have what I call the strong leader strategy. The strong leader strategy is they look for leaders with strong coalitions, and they try to look for and the Chinese government creates relationships with state counterparts, meaning that they recognize the importance that a leader has a position in the government, and they try to prioritize creating a relationship with a leader who has a position in the current government, not just any leader, not just any political elite. So an example here would be the Chinese government tends to create relationships with the regime in power. So if you're in the opposition in the host country, the Chinese government will be less likely to approach you unless the regime is hostile already to the Chinese government. But for instance, in the Jokowi administration, when he came in 2014, and when PDIP came in power, a lot of the relations of the Chinese government, not Chinese firms, did focus on Jokowi. It tended less from Prabowo until Prabowo was incorporated finally in the cabinet in 2019 during Jokowi's second term. This is also true in the Philippine case, where when Duterte won in 2016, most of China's efforts came in to court Duterte rather than make friends with different like political parties across the Philippine spectrum. And this is a different approach when you think about how the United States and Japan do their diplomatic relations. The United States and Japan, they're friends with everybody, different political parties. Whoever wins, they try to be friends with them, so long as they're a mainstream political party. And there's an entire history as to where this comes from, this idea of state counterparts. But I can talk about it later if you want. But this goes back to China's own institutions, its own practices, and etc. Now, in investing in hybrid regimes, the Chinese state tries to invest in, again, somebody who's a strong leader, somebody with broad coalitions. Now, how does the Chinese government forward its political interests through the strong leader? It uses policy instruments, development finance, its banks and state funds to fund major projects in order to befriend that strong leader. And in this particular case, this is where it moves its firms through political rewards and financial safety nets. And the Chinese firms end up now investing in the strong leader. So this is the entire setup that I have. Now, the problem is when we think about the strong leader, or the idea that there is a leader with a broad coalition in the host country, that itself is very hard to if you're the Chinese government or you're a political observer. Now, whether or not a leader has a broad coalition or a narrow coalition, it's a bit hard to sort of get, right? And that's the thing about hybrid regimes. It's unpredictable. It's hard to know whether you have a strong coalition or you have a weak coalition, or you're a strong leader or a weak leader. In any case, I have here the 2x2. So actual strength is broad coalition. Actual strength is the actual coalition of the leader. Perceived strength is where it's simply the perceived coalition of the leader. Yet perceived and actual strength can differ, and it doesn't need to be right all the time. Now, the reason why I argue the Chinese government. The Chinese government tends to make a mistake when it comes to understanding where the regime lies in this like 2x2 spectrum. Now, as I explained a while ago, the difference between the Chinese government and the Western governments is that the Chinese government tries to befriend the regime in power, while Western governments, they try to befriend everybody in the different political spectrum. Now, because the Chinese government exclusively deals with the regime in power, it creates a symbiotic relationship where the host country government feeds the Chinese government information about its strength. And this is where performativity comes in. The host country government would try to sell its own strength to the Chinese government, even though the strength of the government may not correspond with reality. So the case here is the Arroyo administration, where Arroyo initially was very popular in the Philippines, and she had a broad coalition. Yet after a few years, she had a narrower coalition at that time, and it was very shaky. Yet, despite her narrow coalition, she sold her regime to the Chinese government, telling the Chinese government that, I have a broad coalition, and you can, I can protect your interests. Now, this is where I'm still formulating this, so I can clarify this later. So in Arroyo, she had Arroyo was initially, I would say, her coalition was bigger between 2001 and 2004. Yet when around 2003, 2004, her coalition started to weaken. And when the Chinese government invested in Arroyo, a lot of these projects were involved in rent seeking and corruption. And this is where eventually her strength eventually dwindled from high to low. So her narrow coalition became even narrower because of the Chinese money that comes in, and that effectively weakened her. Eventually, when she was kicked out of power, you now have a government under the Aquino government, who is the Aquino government. This is where checks and balances come in, and it was a reaction to the Chinese government. Now, when I mean perceived strength as low, I don't mean this can be. My formulation here is that It's either the Chinese government does not perceives that the leader is weak, or the Chinese government does not know the strength of the leader. Either way, in the left side corner, you don't have the Chinese government does not invest in the country heavily by working with the leader. Yet on the right side, they actually do. Now, I can say the same thing for Malaysia. So Najib was initially a really strong leader. Malaysia is relatively a semi-competitive authoritarian government. And some people call it a weak democracy. When Chinese capital came in under the 1MDB, it effectively made Najib's coalition weaker because of the multiple controversies that came in the 1MDB project and the ECRL. The multiple Chinese projects that came in were involving corruption. It weakened Najib's coalition. And then this is where mode of contention comes in, where Najib's actual strength actually went down. And this is where when Najib was finally kicked out, you now have a new governments that were much more skeptical against Chinese money. So inevitably, what I'm trying to argue about this paradox, and I'm still formulating the 2x2. This may not be the best way to portray it, but what I'm arguing in this paradox is that when China makes a mistake and they invest in leaders with narrow coalition, it paradoxically leads to strengthening democratic institutions, because there's now a reaction from host country elites against the leader in power, and the regime that comes afterwards becomes much more skeptical about Chinese money. Now, this is different in the case of, I would say, Rodrigo Duterte. I'm going to go to Duterte first. So in Rodrigo Duterte, the Chinese government were unsure about Duterte's strength. But Duterte, unlike Arroyo, actually had a stronger coalition of elites. So he wasn't as weak as Arroyo. Yet when the Chinese government invested in Duterte, because Duterte already had a broader coalition of elites, he was able to use the projects to strengthen his coalition further. And this is where Chinese money centralizes the power of the leader. Chinese money is now able to centralize the power of the leader. And in the case of Duterte, what's interesting here is that the relationship between China and the Duterte government, it created this symbiosis where the Duterte government is able to push back against Chinese interests, even if Chinese interest is not fully even if the Duterte government pushes back on the Chinese interest, the Chinese government is unable to punish the Duterte government. So the best example here is the example of the online gambling. A lot of Chinese online gambling investments came in the Philippines during Duterte, and the Chinese government demanded that. Now, online gambling is an illegal form of investment in the perspective of the Chinese government. It is gambling firms owned by former Chinese citizens who basically moved to the United States and to Europe. And they were using online gambling to sort of like to launder money out of China into the Philippines. And the Chinese government demanded the Duterte government to remove online gambling firms from the country many times, and the Duterte government just refused the Chinese government. Between 2016 and 2019, there were over 75 extradition cases imposed on Chinese citizens, or filed by the Chinese government in the Philippines, and the Philippine government just refused 95% of the cases. And that's a case of what I call pushback. Now, in some ways, you can say the same thing about Jokowi. When he came in power in 2014, from my understanding, and I could be wrong here, I don't want to presume my expertise here because you all are the experts in Indonesian politics. My reading is that his strength was lower in the early years of his regime, and then he was able to consolidate it eventually. And in the consolidation of his power, partly through Chinese money, Jokowi Jokowi now has a broader coalition than when he started. And what's interesting in the Indonesia case is that the Jokowi administration has been able to push back in the Natuna Islands, and I've done some research looking at the Indonesian Coast Guard, Indonesian Navy's files on sort of the operations against Chinese ships in the Natuna Islands, and Jokowi has been able to do it, and the Chinese government is unable to punish Jokowi for it because, well, China has a strong relationship with Jokowi, at least when it comes to this, and there's now a big reliance on that. So So this is the number of projects that I did, and then this is like some of the just to clarify the method that I have. I interviewed the Chinese elites to get at the perceived strength of the leader. Like, what do the Chinese elites think of the coalitions of the what do the Chinese elites think of the leader's strength, meaning the leader's coalition? Then I interviewed the Southeast Asian elites to get at what the Chinese think, and then I interviewed experts, academics in different countries to get at the actual strength of the leader. And because of that, I created a two by two. Now I'm still revising it. That's why it was a bit I think some of my categories a while ago did not work, but this is what I'm trying to get at my book. So these are the cases that I look at. And the case summary that I have is, again, mode of contention in Arroyo and Najib. Arroyo and Najib had narrower coalition, and Chinese money made the coalitions even more narrow. And eventually, when they were both kicked out, it strengthened democratic institutions precisely because the elites mobilized to kick out the Chinese projects. Now, I would argue mode of issue linkages occurred under Jokowi and Duterte, where Jokowi and Duterte had broad coalitions at the start, and the Chinese money made it strong. And when Chinese money came in, the coalitions got even stronger. And what happened was the dependency between the Chinese government and both the Duterte and Jokowi governments got even the dependency got stronger as well, where the Chinese government is unable to punish both the Jokowi and the Duterte governments, and yet the Chinese government is also investing a lot of money in both governments, and they need each other in any other way. Now, I think I only have 10 minutes left, but let me just summarize my cases. And I presented mostly my framework. I did a look at the Arroyo administration, where she came in and she was initially popular, and eventually, in some of my interviews with Chinese officials, a lot of Chinese officials reference Arroyo's Chinese roots, and they thought Arroyo was a strong leader, a leader that had a broad coalition. Yet, despite thinking that Arroyo has a broad coalition of elites, what effectively Chinese projects that came in the country, the ZTE scandal, for instance, this is a big embezzlement scheme that was eventually that elites mobilized against these projects, and there's a Supreme Court case against it, and eventually. Most Chinese projects during Arroyo were canceled. So this is a list of the Chinese projects at that time, and there's only one major Chinese project that was completed. Because of the cancellation of the Chinese projects, the Aquino government, I'm sorry for the picture, this is a problem of the what they call this, the program. The Aquino government came in, and then he effectively again strengthened democratic institutions. Now, this is very different from Rodrigo Duterte, where he had a strong coalition at the start, and when Chinese money came, and the Chinese believed that he was a strong leader. So these are some of the interviews I have with foreign affairs ministers and presidential advisors. And so again, more interviews, MOFCOM official and Chinese investor in the Philippines. And eventually, what happened was, because the Chinese believed that Duterte was a strong leader, that he had a broad coalition, they invested a lot of money on him. And by investing a lot of money on somebody like Duterte, it strengthened his power even more, his control of the Philippines. So this is the Kaliwa Dam, where I did my field work. And this is the list of Chinese projects during Duterte, where most of them actually are completed or they're progressing, and only one of them has been delayed. Now, Duterte again, in mode of issue linkages creates pushback. So Duterte pushed back on the Chinese government by protecting Chinese online gambling firms. Duterte used the Chinese online gambling firms to acquire more direct rent-seeking opportunities from the online gambling firms. The Chinese government has been demanding the Duterte government to cancel online gambling. The Duterte government said no. The online gambling firms are now expanding in the Philippines, although they're much smaller right now because some of them left during the COVID pandemic. Now, the two other cases I have is, so the African case that I have is the case of Yaya Jammeh. So I'm working with an African student in Corbel, and he is a case of I would say a leader that was perceived to be a leader with a broad coalition at the start. And when Chinese money came in and invested on him, he made his coalition even stronger. And he is also pushing back against Chinese interests in some way and some form. The Chinese government was demanding that he gives up concessions of his he gives up the concessions of critical resources, and instead of giving it up, he simply gave it to mining companies that are under under Western control. So this is an example again where by investing in a leader with a broad coalition and a leader who is strong, it creates a dependency, and the dependency makes the Chinese government unable to fully exert sort of control over the host country. Now, just some key takeaways on this. China seeks out strong leaders, but there's a paradox. Again, if they get it right, it creates issue linkages where the leader is more autocratic, yes, but it pushes back on Chinese interests. If they get it wrong, they invest in a leader with a narrow coalition, it creates mobilization, and it inevitably strengthens domestic politics. And I would argue this demonstrates the importance of domestic politics here, and this explains some of the difficulties encountered in the Belt and Road Initiative. Apart from that, thank you very much. Again, this is a work in progress. I'm still formulating a lot of my thoughts here, and I would appreciate any comments or response or thoughts or criticisms.
Okay, thank you very much, Alvin. Very interesting presentation, and once again, congratulations on the book manuscript. I'm really happy to hear your achievement, and we are really honored to be in the first audience of your book manuscript. I'm sure there are some questions from the panelists and audience, and I will invite not only panelists but also audience from the attendees. If you have some questions, please raise your hand. We will move you to the panelists so you can speak directly, raise your question directly to Dr. Camba rather than writing in the Q&A session. So I see here Aldi and Sabur has some questions. So Mas Manda, would you mind to move Aldi and Aulia to the panelists so they can speak to the panelists? And also from the panelists, if you have some questions, please raise your hand so we can speak to Alvin. But before the question from the panelists and attendees, Alvin, probably if it's good if you can clarify about the Chinese direct investment. You say that, well, I believe that investment might come from the state and the private sectors. I don't know exactly how the Chinese investment consists of, but probably it's good if you can clarify for the what consists the investment, whether it's mostly from the state or what about the Chinese private capital, or the extent to which the Chinese government control the private capital. So I think some word about this might clarify and the extent to which the Chinese, whether the state or private capital might affect other countries. Thank you, Alvin.
Yeah, thank you, Ciro. Sorry, I didn't clarify this. So there's a big debate in the literature. There's a big debate about, is Chinese private capital simply sort of a tool of the state to sort of control the country, or is Chinese private capital independent and autonomous? And there's also a big debate. Are Chinese state enterprises autonomous, or are they simply tools of the government? This is a big debate in the literature. There's no clear answer. What I can say is that some people have argued that, when you say private, you can say they're more market-oriented. When you say state, they're more politically oriented. People like Ching Kwan Lee have said that's not true. State and private interests in China are very much interlinked. It's hard to say what is their interest. So there's really no clear answer here, Ciro. What I can say, however, my answer here is that it really depends on the size of the company. If you're talking about the biggest companies in China, you're talking about billions of dollars. And if you're talking about the sectors that matter a lot, like critical resources, construction, high levels of technology, whether they're state or private, it doesn't matter. They would be under the influence of the most important actors in the Chinese government, because they're an important part of the economy. If you're talking about smaller firms, let's say a lot of hotels in the Philippines owned by smaller companies, or like retail and wholesale, even small manufacturing, like they create shoes or they create pillows and linen. I think it doesn't matter if they're government, they're more market oriented. They're smaller. They're usually government companies from, you know, some county in like Fujian, and people say it's a government company, it must be controlled by the state. Not really. The state has multiple interests in China. The interest can be economic as well. It's not just political. So I think it depends on the size of the company. I would say it's safe to say that the bigger it is, the more it is linked with the Chinese government.
Okay, thank you, Alvin. Now, let's turn to the question from the panelists and attendees. So now I have 2 hands raised. Let me start from Aldi. I think I saw Aldi in the panelist. Okay, while waiting for Aldi, now let's start from Pak Philip.
Yes, thank you, Pak Siro. Hi, Alvin. Thank you for the presentation, and I'm interested in your framework of the linkage, and then this ties to strong leaders. It seems like it's a variation of the usual democratization theory that the works like Philippe Schmitter and others who work on the international dimension of democratization, and also Levitsky on Western linkage for the hybrid regime to democratize. So you flip the argument. Is my sense correct? And how would you differ your your framework to this framework from the democratization literature? Because it's I think the other spectrum of this kind of argument.
Thank you. I did not realize that, honestly. But I get what you mean. I was reading about hybrid regimes in the past few days. So I would say that I really use hybrid regimes to talk about the specific countries I'm looking at. I don't think my framework applies to all countries. Like what I said, if the country is already authoritarian, what China needs to do is simply to win the authoritarian leader. So Kim Jong-il, Hun Sen, and other autocratic countries. If the country is super democratic, I think that China will simply play by the Chinese government either cannot enter the country effectively, or the Chinese companies will simply operate using the framework of the country more than anything. I really built my framework using sociological theories. It really comes from the idea of like Mark Granovetter, the idea that actors, state government individuals are socially embedded in their context. And no matter how rational they are, they will always bring their sociality with them. That's the argument. So it comes from, and then in reading the literature on Chinese politics and how does politics happen in China, within China, when they try to promote the perspective of what a strong leader is somebody who is willing to they promote officials in China, let's say local official to provinces to national. That's based on how strong or weak the leader is. So usually a stronger Communist Party member is somebody who is able to punish, or let's say there's a protest and it's an extreme form of protest. And then a strong leader would be somebody who's able to like quell the protest for business interests, or sort of like act decisively, or follow the tenets of like the Chinese Communist school. So that's the perspective in that. And then I flipped that argument because when I did my interviews with Chinese officials in the different countries in Southeast Asia, one thing that came about is simply that in democracies, and no matter how weak the democracy is, it's still a democracy. In democracies, politics is unknown for outsiders. You never know what's going to happen. You never know who's going to win. In some ways or form, of course, as insiders, we would know better. But for the Chinese government, they don't know. So what they can simply base it on is if they win the leader with a strong influence over the other elites, then they can be sure that the leader can forward their interests. Yet the perspective of whether the leader is indeed strong or not can be wrong. They can make a mistake, right? That's main, and they can make a mistake because of they focus on the relationship with the leader rather than the other elites. So this goes back to China's own, again, Mark Granovetter, sociality, this idea of focusing on state leaders is a practice of the Chinese government since the 1950s because of communism, because of the way they, it came up in 1950s and sort of like the Jakarta Bandung Conference, for instance. And then this is also where the sociological theory of like symbolic interactionism comes in, the idea of performativity. Host country leaders, no matter how weak they are, they try to sell their strength to the leader. Arroyo government tried to sell herself, oh, I have a strong coalition, I control all of this, I'm able to influence all the elites. But at that time in 2004, it was somewhere in between. She was like in between having a broad coalition and in between having a narrow coalition. Yet when the Chinese money came in, paradoxically, what happened was it actually weakened her coalition further because a lot of the deals that were in there were simply to benefit her own narrow set of elites. So that's how I try to build my framework. It's a combination of sociological theories and other things. Although I get what you mean about Levitsky, it does come up as the flip side, and I need to, just to be clear, the book manuscript that I submitted and that got a revised and resubmit was the older version, and the revised and resubmit was super nice to me. I feel like I can get this book already out. And then my workshop participants came in and then gave me more comments that are much, much harder to address. And those comments are what came in this presentation. That's why I'm trying to reconcile their comments and sort of my presentation. It's hard to sort of have a coherent idea, but that's my longer theoretical explanation. Thank you again, Phillips.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alvin. I think one of the most interesting thing from your presentation is the unintended consequences, especially when it deals with the, sorry to say, the weak leaders. Weak leaders seem to be not bad in this case, but actually it is good. But before you can say more about this, I have some hand raised here. So let me invite. I think I have Aldi, Sabur, and then Pak Rifki. So. Let us finish with 3 questions before you answer, and after that I still have Majelo to raise this question. I hope it's okay. Okay, let me start with Aldi.
Yes, thank you, Professor Zero. Thank you, Alvin. I'm a political science student, and I'm really enjoy your paper at first semester during Prof. Zero lecture. If I may draw a generalization from your thesis, the strong leader factor becomes important for China in approaching investment. I can totally accept it, because in the Middle East, China has been aggressively investing, especially in Saudi Arabia and then United Arab Emirates and Egypt and Iran. Therefore, is it possible for China to ignore the consideration of the stability of the dynamic of the region in the Middle East and only focus on the strong leaders and their network of elites in the Middle and in the Middle Eastern countries? Does something important also to China have the possibility of being involved in the regional domestic conflict, given that you might also consider that China's neglect of the regional dynamic between China's conflict and Southeast Asia countries in the South China Sea is a non-serious matter that could put China investment at risk of pushback. Thank you.
Okay, now for the second question will come from Pak Rifki. The screen is yours, Pak Rifki. You are still muted, Pak Rifki.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, thank you very much, Alvin. This is very interesting topic to discuss. And first of all, I would like to make some notes that basically when you say China's money, I think we really need clarification. What does it mean by China's money? Because in what form of China's money come? So we have to make clear, if you say that this is China's investment, meaning there will be money for investment. If you say that this is China's money, there are different terms and different use for money. If we use, is it for money politics? Is it for bribery? So I think in terms of using the term of China's money, we need some clarification. My second point is regarding the why not only China, basically, why many government also invest to strong leaders, especially for kind of risk analysis on the when they calculate on the possible risk of investment. When they have a stronger leader, they will have more certainty on the investment. But in the democracy, of course, the stability, the political stability of democracy itself will guarantee for the longer term of investment. And my third point, when you said that, well, the Western countries, they deal with everybody, and China only deal with the government. I think that would be very interesting point and strong point. However, if you compare, for example, China with United States, what United States do with many other countries? The US, they work and cooperate with also with the opposition regime. If it is needed, the US will conduct regime change, and the question is there any case that China contribute to regime change in many other countries, or if there is a case in a hybrid regime, whether it is in Asia and Africa? And as far as I see that China do not involve in the operations for regime change. And I think we need to make distinction on that situation. So when we make conclusion, we don't make kind of oversimplification that China's money have direct impact to the behavior of the regime. So thank you very much. That's from me.
Okay, thank you, Pak Rifki. So Alvin, I think we still have some time. So to better address the questions, which are, I think, very important. So let's answer the questions first, these two questions, and after that, I'll open the floor again.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Pariki. I appreciate the questions. Some of this, honestly, is a failure of my presentation to make it clear, but I did address this in my longer manuscript and book. Now, when I mean Chinese money, I basically mean major Chinese projects. What are major Chinese projects? Major Chinese projects are development finance projects that can come as the ECRL, Exim Bank loan or CDB loan to Exim Bank loan to ECRL, Exim Bank loan to ZTE in the Philippines. That can come in even Jakarta Bandung. It's FDI, right? Foreign direct investment technically, but actually it's not. Jakarta Bandung is a special purpose vehicle. It's through Chinese Development Bank loan given to KCIC. And the KCIC implements the Jakarta Bandung. It's an FDI on paper, but honestly, it's a special purpose vehicle. It can also come in the form of grant projects like bridges in the Philippines, for instance. The 2 bridge projects in Metro Manila are grants. They're free projects. They can also come in the form of the Exim Bank loan to the Nigerian train. That's another thing. Now, what is the point of the major project? Major projects are direct are projects above a particular amount, in this particular case above $100 million, and they're forwarded by the central government in China, and they're received by the host country central government in the particular country. So it focuses on the central regimes in power, and that's why I call them major project. Now there are Chinese projects as well outside outside the governments, right? They're outside the central government. They're forwarded by the Chinese firms, usually smaller, and they're forwarded by, let's say, the host country company. Yet when we think about the way the Chinese government wins, for instance, they try to win over the leader of the country. This is where major projects come in. So again, when I think about major project, the form matters a lot, but I do not involve money politics here, and I don't involve this idea of embezzlement or corruption because there's no data. There's no data set to actually show that they're funneling money to political parties. I'm really just talking about something that can be considered major Chinese projects above a particular amount and linked to the central governments of both countries, the host country regime and the Chinese government. Now, your second question is interesting. I don't want to, I mean, partially this comes from now I can answer your idea. I can answer this I can answer this as well. This was in the book, and it's a failure of the presentation on my end. I would have to apologize. I flew in from the United States yesterday. I'm really, really sleepy. I'm in Bangkok right now. So not having a jet lag, jet lag is a terrible thing to have. This idea now, why does the Chinese government exclusively befriend the regime in power instead of all the other political parties? That's a question. Now, what I wrote in my book manuscript is it goes back to the fact that China has a contested form of sovereignty. When the PRC emerged in the 50s, it competed with the ROC, with the Republic of China or Taiwan, for sovereignty. Now, eventually in 74, 73, the entire world recognized the PRC instead of like the ROC. Yet, even up until right now, the idea that the PRC holds sovereignty over the entirety of China is still contested in some form because Taiwan is still there. At the same time, you have numerous movements from Xinjiang to Hong Kong contesting Chinese, the CCP's control over the PRC. Now, this idea of contested sovereignty goes manifest in the fact that when the Chinese government befriends a host country leader, they respect the host country leader's sovereignty, and they can see that by working with the regime in power. In return, they expect the host country regime to respect the Chinese government's sovereignty by being the CCP is the only form of legitimate Chinese government, not this other, not like the ROC, not Taiwan. So there's a special historical significance to, for instance, this idea of the Chinese government's respect for sovereignty, and you can see this in the way the host country governments as well demand when host country governments demand projects from China, the Chinese government usually says yes. Think about Cambodia in 1970s, when Cambodia in 1980s, when Kampuchea, when the Khmer Rouge wanted to collectivize the entire population, the Chinese government just said yes. The same in Vietnam, when the Vietnam wanted to do the Doi Moi reforms following the Chinese government's approach to industrialization, the Chinese government followed. The same thing in the Tazara highways in Zambia and Tanzania. So in other words, the respect for the regime is there for the Chinese government. And that, as a result, they inevitably end up marginalizing the opposition or sort of other political parties, except in circumstances where the regime in power is hostile to the Chinese government. Now, I completely agree with you about the United States. It has a history of regime change, and that's not exactly a good thing. Yet at the same time, I'm not here to defend the US, but I would say that since the 90s, with the exception of Iraq and Afghanistan, since the 90s, there is a countervailing trend in the West, and the countervailing trend is, of course, this idea of the countervailing trend of the way they try to influence countries is through international organizations and through the use of like institutions. They try to change the institutions of the country in order to influence it, while the Chinese government, they try to influence the leader in power. I'm sorry, this is a really long answer, but I appreciate your questions. I would say, however, that the relationship between FDI and sort of like stability is contested as well. There's a lot of quantitative literature that the results are mixed. It's hard to say.
Okay, Alvin, what about the all these questions, the extent to which the Chinese government's behavior may reflect or somehow replicated by other governments, rich governments, say in the Middle East or other parts of the world? What do you think about that?
Well, thank you. So I would say that the governments in the Middle East are somewhat outside my framework, right? Because we're looking at I'm looking at the impact on hybrid regimes. Hello, Zero, are you there? Yeah, you froze it. But so I would say the governments in the Middle East are somewhat outside my framework, right? I'm looking at like regimes in between. Now, nonetheless, I would argue that the other literature and political science where they argue that. Hello?
Yes.
So the other literature and political science does point out that there's an emulation. They try to mimic the governments in the middle and they try to mimic the government, and there's an impact with exporting authoritarianism. Yet, I really doubt it. China's historical experience is so unique. Its institutions are so unique as well. I think the only country that can replicate it is Vietnam. I mean, the other Middle Eastern countries can be authoritarian in their own way, but they will not have the same sort of like techniques, capacity, and sort of like modes of control as the CCP, I would argue.
Okay, thank you, Alvino. I still have some hands raised. So let me start with Sabur, and after that with Majelo. Okay, Sabur, you are on the room right now. Screen is yours, Sabur. Hello, Sabur.
Hello?
Sabur?
Do you hear me, Professor?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. I'm really sorry for my bad connection. That's why I cannot open my camera. Well,
Okay,
I
that's fine,
remember
Sabur.
I remember on the first semester, I had a literature review or a journal about Duterte that was very much interesting. So, and today I found this presentation pretty much informative. Thank you. And I want to compare Duterte with two ex-president of my country. So in this way, it will make more sense to me, because China thought that or said that Duterte is a very strong leader. Well, in 2001 and 2014, America thought the same thing on Ashraf Ghani and president. On 2001, America chose Karzai as interim president of Afghanistan, and America said that Karzai is really strong and he is a knowledgeable person, so he's a proper person to be president or to lead the country. Well, at the end of the day, we found a very much different thing, that even America kicked Karzai from the presidential palace. And same thing goes to Ashraf Ghani. Even America claimed that Ashraf Ghani was the second intellectual person in the world in 2015. Well, in 2021, we all saw the consequences, what happened in Afghanistan. Now, so let me ask my question. So I frame my question something like that. In what context China thought that Duterte was a strong leader? So does Duterte help China to achieve their interest in Philippines? So hope this question makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabur. You can go to answer the question, Alvin.
Okay, thank you for that question. So I'm a bit unsure about I'm applying my framework to the US-Afghanistan relationship, because remember, Afghanistan was a post-reconstruction, so it was reconstructing from sort of like the the US invasion of Afghanistan at that time, when they tried to do regime change from the Taliban. And because you have a construction process, I doubt that my framework on hybrid regimes apply, mainly because I think there's an entire literature on post-war reconstruction and the leadership being in flux. There's a governance gap. So I think it's a different situation. Nonetheless, I think it somewhat applies in some way. I feel like what you're talking about it goes back to some of the concepts of like symbolic interactionism by this idea of like performativity, the idea that the US believed that these two Afghan leaders are strong and they invest in them, and suddenly that did not happen, and what ended up in the long term was the resurgence of the Taliban eventually in 2020. Although it's also complicated, some people have argued that you do have somewhat the expansion as well of democratic rights in Afghanistan, even though in the long term, meaning right now, you have the resurgence of the Taliban, right? But a lot of a lot of Afghan women have gotten like education and rights during it was eventually, it's now in danger, right? But there were gains as well that have been made. Now, I'm not sure whether those gains are worth the sacrifice. It's a really hard question. I would agree with you that the US made a lot of mistakes in Afghanistan, and I'm not sure what to say about it. Now, going back to Duterte. So Duterte is like, he was a strong leader already. He had a broad coalition, and then when the Chinese came in, it got even stronger. And he helped the Chinese government achieve their goals. Yet the Chinese government also achieved the Chinese government also helped him achieve his goals. Plus, Duterte took advantage of the relationship to invite Chinese online gambling firms to increase his capacity to get money. They were earning around $3 million a month from online gambling firms, and the Chinese government was complaining a lot, and the Duterte government just ignored the complaints.
Okay, thank you, Alvin. Now I'm happy to let you know that we also have a very smart student from the Philippines, and would like to ask you, I believe, very good question. Okay, Magelo, the screen is yours, Magelo.
Hello, Alvin. I am Majelo, the only MA student in the only Filipino MA student in UEE. So, well, since the Philippine elections is just right around the corner, May 9 to be specific, my questions will be regarding the topic. So, what do you think would be the relationship of Philippines and China in the next 6 years or the near future when A, the admin bet, son of dictator Bongbong Marcos Jr. wins, B, the opposition in the person of Vice President Leni Robredo wins, especially that according to the pro-admins, Duterte will leave the golden era of China-Philippines relation to the next administration. What would it mean to the economy or even perhaps the maritime tension in the South China Sea/West Philippine Sea? Side note, do you think Beijing has a favored candidate in the Philippine elections to the point that they are funding its campaign to further its investments in the country, more so in the Southeast Asia? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good to see a fellow Filipino in Jakarta. I hope you're enjoying your time there. I had a great time. Indonesian food is much better than Filipino food, but that's my opinion. I don't know if you share my opinion. Great questions. There's no evidence that China is funding any So it's definitely possible for the Chinese government to fund politicians, but not just the Chinese government. Any foreign government can do that, right? There's no evidence yet, and as social scientists, we have to think about what we can analyze as data. I definitely agree that there is a favored candidate from Beijing, and it's obviously Bongbong Marcos, right? Now, what are they doing to sort of help him to win? It's hard to say. There's no clear data to sort of demonstrate it. I think Marcos is going to win according to all surveys. Sadly, I want the other one to win. And obviously, if Marcos wins, you will have a strong relationship between Manila and Beijing. If Robredo wins, I would say Robredo goes back to the Aquino administration, where she would fight for the maritime claims in the West Philippine Sea, at the same time impose restrictions on Chinese money or Chinese investments going in the Philippines. I would say that it's interesting. I was in a meeting a while ago with people from JICA in the Japanese organization, and then one of the Japanese professors asked me the question. I wrote this Nikkei Asia article on Marcos and the Philippines, or Marcos and China, and then I wrote about the consulate in Ilocos Norte in the northern province of the Philippines, right? And the Japanese professor asked me if this was a long-term vision by the Chinese government. It was just a long-term vision to sort of invest in Marcos in 2007, and in the long term he would win the presidency so they can have an ally in the Philippines. What my answer was, and my answer still is, that it was more like an accident. And I feel like this is something that's neglected in international relations. A lot of political issues sometimes are accidental in nature. When I mean accident, I don't mean it just happened. But in 2007, the Marcoses were outside national politics. I mean, the people in power were the Arroyos and the Villars, and nobody thought that Marcos would actually come back in the national era. The Beijing did not target the consulate in Ilocos Norte. What happened actually was a lot of provinces were courting a lot of provinces wanted the Chinese to build the consulates in their own areas so they can draw in more Chinese investments. The Marcoses just happened to win out because they offered land to the Chinese government without the Chinese government paying a significant amount of money. Now, in the long term, that eventually paid off because the Marcoses are now back in power, and are going to be back in power because I think they're going to win. And that's really sad. And if that happens, we can expect a continuation of the Duterte administration.
Okay, thank you, Alvin. Now we are approaching the end of the webinar. So let me take the opportunity to ask you my last question, Alvin. I have two questions. One is theoretical and one is practical. For the first one, I like the framework, this I say actor-oriented framework, elite-oriented framework, which is very clean and parsimonious to explain fundamental thing in terms of investment. But I think people will wonder the extent to which you accommodate some structural factors. For example, the extent to which the structure of capital within the country affect the decision making, whether the capital was concentrated in state-owned enterprises, for example, or whether it is actually controlled by mostly by the private sectors, for example. So probably, or probably there are other structural conditions in which the state leaders, how they decide the investment might change. That's the first part. The second part is that you see that initially I thought that the Chinese government will have a high trust to Chinese diaspora, which are spread in many other countries. So if they if they put their trust in Chinese diaspora, they shouldn't think about the strength of the government, regardless of the power of the government, whether it is strong or not. If they have the words of the Chinese diaspora, the investment should be successful. So why it seems to me that your framework doesn't accommodate these things. Okay, and the second part, which is practical, if the Chinese investment actually has unintended consequences of supporting strong leaders, and if we put in the current context of the rise of the populism, in which many people say no, the political conflict is not between the left and right anymore. Somehow it is between the the globalists and nationalists, and the strong leaders. Often they are associated with nationalist aspect of the politics, right? So the extent to which the Chinese investment strengthen the strong leaders can strengthen the political polarization between the nationalist globalists. So if the investment is successful, what do you think the extent to which actually the investment contribute to deepening polarization between the nationalists and globalists? And if it is right that the investment contribute to deepening this kind of situation, what do you think of the alternative way? What is the solution for the people in these countries to reduce at least the polarization? Thank you, Alvin.
Okay, so I have answers to the first question. The second question is a bit new to me. I've never encountered that before. My assumption here would be a strong leader would a leader with a broad coalition would be somebody with somebody with the backing of the nationalists, if I'm not mistaken. Like the Duterte administration, a lot of like anti-Western Filipinos, but sort of like pro I don't want to call them pro-Filipinos, but very inward-oriented looking people. They do like the Duterte administration. The same with Modi in India, Erdogan in what they call this in Turkey. And yeah, that's interesting. I feel like it's an implication where you increase polarization between like in the countries. I don't have a solution for it, but I think that's a really interesting point that you make. Polarization increases, and if that's the case, we can expect the leader to make decisions that is going to be backed by the population, and decisions that may not be good for global integration, decisions that may lead to further conflict. I don't have a solution there, but I would say this goes back to the need for countries to, or the need for the citizens of countries to think about democracy more, sort of like strengthen the way we relate to each other as people and as communities, and have better ways of communicating with each other, and sort of like try to reach out to people outside your echo chambers, right? Which is the big problem right now with polarization. People just have their own echo chambers and they don't really try to talk to one another. Now, going back to the first one, sort of like the first question of the structural factors, I do believe that, so I try to like have the framework that's, it can integrate some of the factors in. Now, I feel like, whether or not the regime is has largely state-owned enterprises like Malaysia, or whether it's private-owned capital like the Philippines, you do have the same behavior coming from the Chinese. You can still induce the leader to sort of go to your side by offering major Chinese projects to the leader, whether or not the capital is concentrated in, let's say, agriculture, mining, wherever. Infrastructure works in any of these countries, right? Especially countries in the global south. Now, there might be other structural factors that I'm not accounting for, but I'm hoping at least by just focusing on, I would say, the middling countries, so-called hybrid regimes, I could be able to account for those factors. Nonetheless, you are correct. There might be things I'm not looking for, and I need to think about how to revise this much more in order to integrate those things. But yeah, I'm trying to get at a framework where I can like apply those things, where I can integrate these factors without sort of like it applies regardless of what factor is in there. The second is now the Chinese diaspora, actually, this isn't in the something I did not present here, but when I think about the role of brokers, you do have the role of brokers and sort of the role of like host country elites. In the framework that I presented, and I was too fast to sort of like talk about, my presentation was a bit too fast. The relationship between the leader and sort of the Chinese government is mediated by a set of elites in between. That includes Chinese elites, policy elites, company elites, and host country elites. So oligarchs, for instance, or like economic elites, or like political players in different countries. Amongst these actors are, I would say, Southeast Asian Chinese. So in the case of Southeast Asia, yet in outer Southeast Asia, of course, you don't have this population. So I would say that it's not super central to the framework. Now, empirically speaking, however, this idea that the Chinese government has high trust on the Chinese diaspora is not true. A lot of papers have actually shown that there is no strong relation. There is some moderately there is a positive relationship between the Chinese diaspora and Chinese investments, but the relationship is becomes null and insignificant the moment you control for other things, other variables. The other thing is that if you look at the cases even in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, in the Philippine case, a lot of the oligarchs that mobilized against the Chinese projects during Arroyo's time were the Filipino Chinese. The same in Indonesia. There are people in the economic elite circles of Indonesia who are Indonesian Chinese who are squeezed out because Chinese money is like coming in the country. So I would say that there's actually a lot of variation in terms of like that. It's less about the diaspora question. It's a question of the people who will side with the Chinese government are capitalists who have something to gain from China, whether or not their assets are complementary with what the Chinese are bringing in. Whether or not they're Indonesian or they're Indonesian Chinese or the Filipino or Filipino Chinese. That is what I found in my research. It's more about the nature of their asset rather than their ethnicity.
Okay, thank you very much, Alvin. This is very interesting discussion, and I can go with my questions, but unfortunately it is 3:31, and I'm afraid you're still jet lagged after traveling from the United States. So I think you need to have some rest. I really appreciate that you accept my request to give the presentation, and thank you very much. And I think many things that we have learned from your presentation, if I might to summarize a few things, that the Chinese investment can have serious unintended consequences. Whether it is good or bad, it may depend on the context of the political situation within each country. It might strengthen the strong leaders, which might have certain ramification, but it might also help countries with weak leaders might have better political outcomes. And the last point, I think, which is more interesting, but I think we can discuss further in another session. But before we close this session, if you have, say, a few last word for the audience today, please, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. You're the first audience that I'm trying to. This is the first time I presented. I'm trying to revise my book at the same time incorporate the comments of my workshop participants and the book peer reviewers. And it was particularly difficult to put it together because my framework was similar before, but my argument was different. And sort of like this idea of like a mode of linkages, mode of mode of contention. I did not call it in that way before in my book, but I had to change it just for this book, this one. But I appreciate it, and I'm going to do better next time. And I will send your professors free copies once I get this book out, and hopefully I can write it better at that time. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Alvin. Once again, congratulations on the book manuscript. We are looking forward to reading it in the near future. And once again, thank you for accepting our request. And if you happen to go to Indonesia to do fieldwork, please let us know. You are very welcome. And again, you are welcome at our university. And see you again next time. Thank you. And for all the participants, thank you very much for attending to this webinar, and see you again in the next webinar. Thank you.